Hello, my name is Ilaria Maselli, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with Professor Michael Hüther. He's a famous German economist and historian, and one of the three authors of Exhausted Globalization, Between the Transatlantic Orientation and the Chinese Way. Hello, Professor Hüther, and welcome.
Hello, and many thanks for inviting me to this wonderful discussion.
The book is a thorough reflection about the downturn globalization is going through. It investigates the reasons why this second globalization lost energy and appeal, and sketches possible ways to rescue it. It is an intense read, which I found rewarding for three reasons. One, it makes use of Conference Board data, thank you for that. Two, it digs very deep into past waves of globalization, adding a lot of information and data to what is commonly known. And three, it looks at globalization not only as a process of economic integration, but also with normative lenses, which means looking at globalization in terms of ideas and power structures. I'm going to start my interview with you, Professor Hüther, talking a little bit about what's happening in Hong Kong that we hear in the news all the time in the last days. And what I'm thinking is that we grew up with the idea that economic development would somehow trigger democracy. And so I wonder, are the current protests in Hong Kong the first sign of that? So do we expect democratization to spread in China?
Up to now, we have to confess that it's not the case. It's a struggle in Hong Kong and a special story there. But looking back to the early 1990s, most of the politicians in the Western world had the idea that we only had to start free trade with China, then the outcome will be in the end democracy. And this was called this hypothesis of modernization. And as we all know, this is not the case up to now. We failed with our expectation to hope that via economic integration, via opening borders, via working together and cooperate in very different fields of economic activity, we will also have an impact on the political situation. And that's totally wrong. We have learned over time that in China, the normative basis is still different. And the normative roots of this open up of the society in economic terms started in the end of 1978, when Deng Xiaoping announced at the People's Congress saying that we will use the capitalist order, the mechanism of the capitalist world, on the basis of the dictatorship of the people. So that's still true. So they try to use all the advantages of a market economy, the efficiency, which is the highest you can achieve in an economic system, for their political goals. So, and this is the point we see, that globalization is about normative conflicts, and the idea that the Western style globalization, rooted in the transatlantic West, will succeed on its own, this is not a very realistic one. We have to realize that this is a normative conflict and we have to work on it.
And actually, if I look around, it looks like this idea now of the Western idea of globalization is failing in a way right now, because trade growth is very weak, if not negative at this moment. There is a general backlash in Western populations, if I think of Brexit, for example, and there is increasing sympathy towards tariffs, trade tariffs. So why is that happening? Why is current globalization losing steam?
We have several reasons for this exhaustion of globalization. The first is in itself in the economic system. Over a long time of deepening of division of labor cross-border, we are coming to a level which is very high, and we have something like a standstill. You cannot go on from day to day to a further intensification of division of labor. So we see, for example, that the world trade has the same growth rates over a year than the world production. This is totally different to the last two and a half decades. In this last 20, 25 years, we had most of the years a situation that world trade has a higher growth rate than world production. And this is a very simple indication for deepening the division of labor across border. So the intensification of globalization has came to a standstill in a, so to say, normal process of internal exhaustion, which after such a long process of investing, of cooperation and so on, is not really a surprise. The second is the number of economies which are very dynamic, GDP growth in the year over 4%, the number of countries is stagnating. In the past, we saw from year to year higher number of countries with such tremendous growth in GDP terms. Then we see that the developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are lagging behind. We just see some hope, but it's still the situation that the capital allocation is a Western Hemisphere story. It's not in the way from the north to the south. It's in the Western Hemisphere market-oriented or market-based capital allocation. And this also makes clear that we have some restrictions in these globalization due to institutional settings. And another package of arguments or reasons is related to the situation in the different societies. We not only see some criticism about globalization and the market economy, at the same time we see criticism about democracy. We have the new experience of illiberal democracies, Hungary, Poland, for example. And the people react no more in the same way than they did 25 years ago to open borders. So we have a distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres in a society. People who can match the pressure from the outside, from external markets on opening the borders, and the other who are more reluctant and inward looking. And this is just a situation which is very prominent, which is very profiled in these years.
I would like to dig a little bit deeper on that, because you interpret globalization, the previous one and the current one, as this tension between the international part of society, which you call networks, and the nation states, which are the hierarchies. Can you explain a little bit better this concept?
And the idea of this notion of hierarchies and networks is the way to understand what's going on in world history. Neil Ferguson has wrote a book on this, on hierarchies and networks, English-based historian, and he said that if you're looking on the past, you see that in some periods the networks are dominant because the people are organizing their daily life, they cooperate in a horizontal way. So the horizontal axis is a dominant orientation for creating wealth, working together, defining the public sphere. And then it is in line with the hierarchies which define the constitution, the legal framework, and the political power. But over time, you have a pressure, you have a tension between the power of networks and the power of hierarchies. This, for example, was the case in the early 20th century when the First World War started. It was just bringing back the power to the hierarchies, which stopped the networks, the horizontal way and the vertical axis were more prominent. And then after time, you see that, for example, the progress made in communication technologies gave the power back to the networks. And they're still working on their own, the platform economies we just see. And I interpret the idea of illiberal democracies, of the appeal which has China for some people in the West as well, saying that there is also need for organizing it stronger, to have a strong power to bring hierarchy back. So you can say that's something like a competition between hierarchies and networks, and we have phases in history which are predominantly defined by the networks, and then phases which are defined by the hierarchies.
So globalization is a phase in which the networks become stronger.
That's true. The networks then have the power. They define the progress in economic terms and societal terms, and then over a long time, then they define also the need for adjustment for the political system. And the question is in which way the political system would answer to that.
I have a question that requires a very sharp answer. So, is the European Union a network or a hierarchy?
The European network is a framework for strengthening the networks in Europe.
Okay, so it goes in the international. Well, that triggers another question, which is, I heard many times the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, well, the exiting one, that the European Union is a way to smooth the rough edges of globalization. Did it fail in this goal? I mean, there is backlash against the EU as well.
Yes, there's the backlash against the EU, but if you're looking at the Eurobarometer polls, you see that the acceptance of European integration in the wider population has increased since Brexit. So this is also very impressive. We have a very high acceptance in the population, to the people of Europe toward the European Union and European integration, not in all details of European integration, but in a general sense. And the idea to have these European integration as something like smoothing the rough edges of globalization, I think it's a good idea, because Europe is a stronger power and could be a part of the new political setting of the world order. We are discussing, will be this order of G3 or G2? Order between United States and China, or is Europe in itself a strong power on the world scene? If it is the case, then Europe can define the standards for global interaction, global integration. And this will bring the ideas of the European people to the international scene. Otherwise, we will not very successful. Germany is too small, and it's, despite of the fact it's the biggest economy in Europe. France will be too small, despite of the fact that Macron plays a different role, as France is the biggest state of the world, but it's not the case. So we see that the European integration, the European Union, is a power to bring the European ideas, European values, the preference of the European people to the world scene. In this sense, yes, it's an instrument to smooth the rough edges of globalization, and you can bring more security and stability to the people, otherwise it will not happen. And we can organize our markets here internally, which we are not able to organize on a national basis.
So you think it's succeeding?
It's succeeding, but it's not in the end. And we have, for example, one very simple point is the GDPR, we had a controversial debate in Europe just before it was enforced.
We should maybe just say in 2 words what is GDPR, because we have people listening from other parts of the world.
Sorry, the European regulation of data protection in this new digital world. And there was a very critical and controversial discussion before this law was enforced. Just it was enforced, after that we see that Europe as a first mover had the advantage to set the standards globally. And for example, in California, they're just trying to have the same regulation, because for the big companies of the internet world, the GAFAM, the big companies from the Silicon Valley, there's no chance for regulatory arbitrage, because it's too expensive. These companies are based on scaling. If they are not able to scale, they are not able to attract capital in the same way than before. So they need the same standard worldwide. And the same standard, the first standard will be defined by the first mover, and the first mover in this case is Europe. So Europe in itself makes clear what is the advantage about Europe in digital world.
We're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Professor Hüther on the book Exhausted Globalization, Between the Transatlantic Orientation and the Chinese Way.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast? Go to tcb.org/EU and explore our Economy, Strategy and Finance Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like global economy, labour markets and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos and blogs.
Hello and welcome back to our conversation with Professor Hüther on the book Exhausted Globalization, Between the Transatlantic Orientation and the Chinese Way. I would like to start this second part of our podcast with a quote from chapter 1, where I found the trilemma of Dani Rodrik really nicely explained. So you say, globalization defines the same economic conditions for all and therefore places a pressure to reform on politics and society, which is hard to escape. What began and is still seen as an expression of freedom will ultimately lead to a loss of freedom in terms of national sovereignty. The primacy of politics can no longer be guaranteed. Can you explain this? Because this is actually a good way to interpret what we see, and also the success of parties, nationalist parties that we see in Germany, we see in Italy, in the UK, I mean, in several countries. This is happening today, in fact.
Yeah. To make it very short, the success of globalization itself creates new problems. because the people always see that there's the interference in their daily life from abroad. Interference in their daily life from different economies which had new innovations which affect your organization of what's going on over the day. The digital transformation, for example. Migration is a pressure from abroad. International new setting of rules and cooperations and procedures also will interfere at home. So you see that on the one hand, we open borders, we have a new way for cooperation to integrate economic systems, to intensify division of labor, but the backlash is that you have to adjust. You have to adjust to the new standards set by this global open world. And that means this trilemma, which was defined by Dani, Rodrik, saying at the same time we have open borders, it's not so easy to also have a sovereign democracy in national borders. So what is needed is, on the one hand, we need a strong state, it's quite clear, because he had to focus on the public goods, he want to deliver at home. And we need a cooperation and securing the borders, because the people are asking for stability and security in the same time. They're not only asking for efficiency and wealth creation. And this is what just came to this on the scene in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years. It changed, it's totally different to what we saw before. For a long time, the people accepted that globalization is a good idea. We will have a broader chance or better chance to move on with our wealth creation on the highest level. And now we see we have to adjust it in this idea of an embedded economy.
And I wonder if immigration is part of this opening of borders that are not only for goods but also for people. And if I remember well, it's in chapter 2 where you make where we can make a parallel between immigration today and in the first globalization, where you say in chapter 2 that back then something like 52 million people left Europe looking for fortune outside Europe, and many of them went to the US, something like 32 million. So I'm curious, what was the discourse, what was the perception of immigration back then, and is it as difficult as it is today?
Before answering this question in detail, let me say in general that we tried to interpret globalization not only as that has something to do with global trade. With that, there are 4 different ways for global integration. It's trade with goods and services. It's capital allocation globally. It's knowledge diffusion, and it's migration. All these different ways bring the societies and the economies together, create new pattern of cooperation. And in the 19th century, it's really interesting to see that migration was something like a mechanism of compensation. It was the bad situation in the center of Europe, because very bad shape of the economies. We had some problems in agricultural to provide all the goods was needed to bring food to the people. On the other hand, there was a new frontier idea moving to the west, and the travel costs reduced remarkable, so the people could afford for this ticket for transfer to the United States. And for the United States, this migration from Europe was an engine for create new cities, new corporations, new companies. So it was really a part of this startup of the United States as an industrial economy, parallel to Great Britain and later on some states in the middle center in Germany in this time. And later on, this was open-minded. Migration was not really a topic. The people walked around. But then it changed in the late 19th century, when there was not only migration from Europe to the United States, but even more migration from China. So then there was the first migrants, after some period of time, have the idea that it will be more reluctant to further immigration from people. To see that the same in Germany today. The first migrants which came in the 1950s or 1960s are most conservative of further migration, open migration systems. So this was also a discourse which was something like a business cycle. Open, it started, more reluctant than in the late 19th century, and we have to learn that societies also react in a different way. Sometimes they see the chances, and sometimes they see more risk because of the adjustment needs. If people are coming, you have to fund them, you have to give opportunities for them. It has to do with the economic situation at your home turf. So is there the flexibility to bring all the people in? And otherwise, sometimes you have situations you are grateful that the people are coming.
And so I have to wonder, why did the first globalization stop at the beginning of the 20th century? What went wrong in the 1910s? Was it immigration? Was it trade?
You can have two different answers to that. The first is very simple. This was the backlash of hierarchies or networks, because then the political powers started this conflict. And since 1910, there was the feeling that there is something in the air of a new conflict. The people had the idea that of a long time of freedom and peace, 40 years of peace since the German-Franco War in 1970, there must be something new, because the conflict in itself between Germany, the new unified German Reich, the Deutsches Reich, German Reich, and France was never solved. There was no diplomacy tried to bring these two states together. The German Emperor was the very strange person who had some look to the east, but he was very close to the Austrian-Hungarian Emperor. And from this side, this was a conflict which was a little bit in the air. Then the second is, it was something of fin de siècle mood. The fin de siècle is a cultural mirror, so to say, of this changing perception of the open world, that something maybe came to an end. On the other hand, you could say it was only a stop, or it was something which has some roots in the late 19th century. The roots in the late 19th century said the governments started to impose tariffs. Again, they had a more restrictive regulation on migration. So in the late 19th century, something changed in the negative political perception of globalization, which started in the early 19th century. And so there's this smooth way, more regulated international cooperation, and the other way you had this political chaos. And it was really 1914 with its own roots. This was finished from one day to another. This globalization finished, and it needs. Then we needed 6 to 7 decades to come back.
Is this where we're going now? I didn't want to ask this question, but it really felt like a déjà vu, what you just talked about.
Yeah, but the story is different. The first globalization had not really a clear starting point, but a clear end. The second globalization had a clear starting point. It was, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the People's Congress, the People's Party's Congress in China in October 1978, or 11 years later, the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, of the Iron Curtain. Since then, the spread up of market economies and new integration perspectives to the east was something like an engine for globalization, and we have not the idea that it could be finished tomorrow. But what we see is that globalization also in itself needs to be reflected, needs to be embedded in the national political system. So we have to be aware that this trilemma of globalization is not only a theoretical concept, it's of practical concerns, and the people want to get an answer on that. We want to manage our daily life at home, and we have to be aware that there should be some need to counteract the interference from abroad. So this is a need for European integration, as I said before. Via Europe, we can try to set standards on the global scene, and we have to work on the security issue, because if we don't want to pay money for our security, another state as the United States don't want to do it in the future as they did in the past. So we have to pay for our own, and then we will see that there's a new chance of managing globalization in an embedded way.
And you argue somewhere towards the end, I think, that at the end of the book, that for globalization to have a new wave, that globalization has to become more inclusive. Can you give some example of how globalization can be more inclusive?
Inclusive globalization is the idea of bringing first countries in who are not just in this global open scene. This is, as I mentioned very early in one answer, the Sub-Saharan Africa. We have some hope because they started to create a free trade area in Africa. We do have this global compact from the G20 in 2017, decided as a different approach, a new approach in development policy, to ask the people in these countries to bring in their own idea of reform, not only what we think in the Western world should be the appropriate reform, or they have to define, and then we will help them to create their own institution. That is the first. The second is, in the digital work, we need standards and quality in public sphere. Otherwise, this public sphere will be destroyed by fake news, by echo chambers, by all these social media activities. They have ambiguity in it. They can have a positive impulse because it's easy to have a communication worldwide. You can, in the real time, have all information you need, all data you want to have. In the same time, you can bring in fake news. You can destroy the public sphere via these very negative approaches in manipulating public discourses. So we have to be aware of that. We need standards for that.
And is there a role for multinational companies here? Should they take sides on public issues? We actually asked this question a year ago in our CC Challenge survey, and so we asked CEOs if companies should take a public stance, and only 7% of them believe that this is a must-have in a future reorganization. But you argue on the opposite side of this. So what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, I think these CEOs are mostly wrong. To make it very clear, due to the fact that globalization is a normative conflict. And the conflict between the Western world and its deep roots of the late 18th century, the French Revolution values and the American Revolution values, the rights of the individual, the freedom of the people, the rule of law, democracy, sovereignty, and so on. All this is our package also for the market economy. So this is surrounding the embedding of the market economy. Here are we in, so all actors have the responsibility to stick to the rules, to accept the procedures of this democracy-defined setting of market economies. And this is what we see in the new system conflict between the transatlantic West and China. And the second is that the people at home ask if the license to operate we give to the companies will hold for the future if they didn't see or didn't realize that they have their roots at home. So we will see in the future that the companies have to react to these needs in a way of value-based acting, make clear what is the advantage of their efficiency ideas and their new products and new services, but they have to bring back to the license to operate defined by the people at home.
Thank you, Professor Hüther, and thank you all for joining this edition of Off the Shelf. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please remember to subscribe for our Off the Shelf channel at tcp.org/podcast. Thank you and goodbye.